Well, it's really nice to be sketched out here, holding on to Brenda's hand in this wonderful home, Dennis and Mary, where we've had so many great times. And thank you that we have opportunity to be together again today for a couple of sessions. In Jesus' name, I know you're going to bless us greatly. Amen. If you'll remind me in about 35, 40 minutes to flip this, I'll appreciate it. Now, we started this series, and this is going to be number 4, I believe, if the Lord blesses us today, like I think He's going to in the current tape series, with Jesus the Cosmic Christ and New Creation. And God just gave me that title when I was reading one day and meditating out of the clear blue. And as it turns out, it fits like a perfect key in a complex lock, because that's exactly it. Jesus, the historic Jesus, the cosmic Christ that He came to parcel Himself out to be. This is why it's Eucharistic. This bread is my body, which is broken for you. This wine is my blood. And He came especially to multiply Himself. God came to give us the divinization of the whole human race. That's why Jesus said, "Ye are gods." And yet so much, and it's not really a surprise when you think about it, so much of Christendom institutionally is dedicated to the historic Jesus buried in a leather-covered book. And they like to hear stories about how Jesus used to interact with people and how God Himself, before and after Jesus, used to interact with people by the Spirit and be able to speak to somebody and tell them to go to a certain street in Damascus. But they hear that on Sunday morning, Sunday evening, prayer meeting, whatever. But they're stuck in the historic Jesus, the Jew who said, "It's absolutely necessary for you that I disappear. It's expedient for you that I go away. Otherwise, the Spirit will not come." Now, in our previous studies, we studied Teilhard de Chardin's great phrase, "spirit matter." That matter is spirit, and spirit is matter, and matter is frozen light. All those wonderful things to think about, to ponder, to meditate on. Jesus is Eucharistic. He said, "I am parceling myself out. Take, eat, this is my body." And so the words that I speak are spirit, and they're life. And so Jesus then, when He disappeared, took up residence in a new body. And that's the cosmic Christ who has taken up residence in us. And that's why, thank God, today you have so many really spiritually sensitive and perceptive people, like Matt Fox and John Sanford writing a mystical commentary on the fourth gospel, psychological commentary on the fourth gospel, on John. All of this is on my bibliography, by the way. And by the way, I think that's one of the most exciting bibliographies I ever put out. That has some fantastic books on it. You want to especially take note of David Ebaugh's book, El Elyon, which the Spirit told me to elevate to number 1 on that bibliography. But in any case, John Sanford says, every word in the Gospel of John, as I mentioned in the last study, is not from John, the beloved apostle. Not a word from John, the beloved apostle. It's another John entirely. And what he writes is spoken by the cosmic Christ, not by the earthly Jesus. You see, so many believers don't realize that. So that the early church had such confidence in what you heard me preach all these decades, and really it is decades with some of us now. For example, way back in the Hebrews series, today it says 3 or 4 times in Hebrews 3 and 4, if you'll hear His voice. This is written to first century Christians. Harden not your heart. God speaks in the heart. The genius of the new covenant is, I will put my law in your mind and I'll write it in your heart. Today, if you'll hear His voice, harden not your heart. Well, the early church had such confidence in that still small voice. Now, mind you, many of them couldn't read. Do you ever think about that? Not everybody was literate back in those days. But they had such confidence in the voice of God in the heart that they attributed the voice, the words of the cosmic Christ, to Jesus in the Gospels. Now that's also a fact of biblical criticism. Scholars have told us that for years. We haven't been able to hear it. That's why there are books like Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time on my bibliography list. God never intended us to be worshiping an icon called a historic Jesus back there who died and disappeared on purpose. Died on the cross for our sins and rose again and ascended and disappeared and became Christ after the Spirit, so that we're plainly told, and I have to emphasize it again and again because these things are radical and they don't take hold of us very rapidly. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, though we've known Christ after the flesh, yet now henceforth we do not know him that way anymore. We do not know Jesus as a Jew. We know him as the cosmic Christ. And that's all important because that means that you're the temple of the living God. As God promised in 2 Corinthians 6:16, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I'll be their God, and they'll be my people. He dwells in you, he walks in you. And, you know, there's an old hymn I used to love to sing, and if I missed anything from the institutional church, and since I've departed from it 5 years ago, it would be, and he walks with me and talks with me and tells me I am his own, I come to the garden alone. Remember that great old hymn? Every day ought to be that. And it is that with me, and I know it is with many of you. In what kind of circumstances? In all kinds of circumstances. We're troubled on every side, yet not distressed. Yes, we have times when we're troubled on all sides. We have times when we go forth with glee and we're happy. And I'm very happy today. I came down this morning in the beautiful sunshine. We've had the lousiest winter in our 5 years in the Bighorn Basin. We had snow and slop in the basin, which we never do. It's a banana belt. Well, it wasn't a banana belt. No bananas growing this winter, I'll tell you that. And I got sick of it at 67 years of age. And I was arguing with God all the time, give me back my bananas. And it was so nice to come east, and it'll be a while out west before it clears up yet. And we're going to have a tremendous runoff because we've got the biggest snowpack in 3 years. And God's telling me it'll be without loss of life, limb, or property in our area. And I thank God for that, and I believe it. But coming down this morning, I was singing 2 or 3 of my favorite songs. Every day above ground is a good day. And, oh, Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. Remember that old chorus? And then the one that I put at the end of the last study that Matt Fox was teaching people, it's in every one of us to be wise. I hope you heard that chorus. Did you hear that at the end of the last tape? Isn't that a beautiful chorus? Well, I'll see if I can repeat them for you, since it was, wasn't the melody beautiful? And what harmony at the end of it. It's in every one of us to be wise. Find your heart. Open up both of your eyes. We can all know everything without ever telling why. It's in every one of us to be wise. Isn't that a great chorus? And I thank God that Matt Fox was led to close one of his sessions with that. So we have our circumstances. You and I may as well make up our mind. I try to stress this more and more. And, you know, the first study was entitled Remember Lot's Wife and Don't Look Back, because there's a price attached to this thing, a big price called the cross. And then reduced to zero. Scientifically, I attempted to explain the cycling in and out of the black holes is the very essence, the guts of the universe. It's the foam that makes up everything at the subatomic levels. You have to cycle in and out of black holes. Mary and I and Dennis were talking about that before we began this session. And they've been cycling in and out of some black holes. So have we, real estate-wise and otherwise. I know Brenda was mentioning she had. We all do. And we have to do that. That is a reality principle. But we can learn a little better. We can evolve a little bit more. And this being a time when we're taking a leap forward in quantum spirituality. To understand how to handle that better. Yes, there's a thing to do when you're cycling through a black hole, and that is for most of us, and especially if you have a disposition like I do, and like I know Brenda has here, to vent and to let God know what you think in no uncertain terms. How can you do it otherwise? It's good for you. It gets the blocks out of the way emotionally. But you'll go through those times. You have to go through those times. And when you are full of rage, express it in a place where it doesn't harm anybody. Dump it on God. He doesn't mind. I have it on the best of authority. He's told me so many times. And you'll have times when you fight with him. But you have to go through these cycles. And that's why I did number 2 there, reduced to 0. And it's because, imagine hearing in a dream from Stephen Hawking, the second great dream I had with Stephen Hawking way back there in 93 in June, when he appears to me briefly and says, in a naked singularity or a black hole, everything blows up. I didn't even know what a naked singularity was at that time. Well, what it comes down to is, it's the lid that God puts on a black hole just before it becomes a white hole, when all of a sudden it becomes positive energy and creative energy. And you and I are the transformers, and we are members of God, and we are co-creators, and we are finishing and filling up Christ's work and his sufferings for the body of humanity. Now, we are a redemptive people. We are a royal priesthood. We are Merlins. We are magic people. We don't do it very well, but we can learn to do it better and better. There are some people who've done it well, but I'll tell you, when you do it well, amazing things happen, and you know we can learn, and it takes time, believe me, to learn to do it a little better, and then all of a sudden you have a leap forward. I was saying this morning before we began, I feel the most contented and peaceful and satisfied that I have my entire life. And I've had a rugged life as a gunfighter for God. My prophetic ministry, reviewing old journals, reminds me of the price I paid for it. Not that I'm not still paying a price, but I have an entirely different thing to do. I'm God's man in the desert. And I'm doing exactly what God wants me to do today. And I'm more contented and peaceful than I've ever been. In fact, my lovely wife said to me the other day, "You're turning into a gentle old man." And that's a high compliment for me, and I thank God for it. Now, when you think about this, and our task, keep working at it. Be encouraged. We all have our down times. Expect them. We must have them. That's part of it. And when you're in that kind of energy, live it out to the end. Live your depression. Live your darkness out to the end. Go through it. Now, it's easy to sit here when I'm not in it and say that, but if you were to be allowed to read my journal when I'm in it, you'd see an entirely different vocabulary. And I want to be very honest and confess that to you. And there's a lot of purple in my journal, because it isn't easy to go through those times and to have the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune and the rest of it shot into your gizzard. But go with it. Go with the flow, because you'll cycle out again. What I want to stress above all things is, listen to that third tape, because if you don't go through the cycle, if you fight the process, and we all do at times because we're human and can't help it otherwise, it takes a little bit longer. Wise heart. That's why I put that chorus at the end of it. It's in every one of us to be wise. Find your heart. Open up both your eyes. We can all know everything without ever telling why. It's in every one of us to be wise. God's put the wisdom in your heart and in your deepest being. I will put my law in your mind. You are epistles of Christ, ministered by us, written not with ink. Not with ink. All institutional Christians should take note of that it's not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but in the fleshy tables of the heart. In the fleshy tables of the heart. God is in you, in the deepest part of your being, in the core of your being. Now, there's a man that you've heard me mention from time to time over the last several years, and his name is Dr. Walter Russell. He's long since gone home to be with the Lord. But there's a mansion that sits on a hilltop down off the Blue Ridge Parkway. In fact, I think it's visible from the parkway, is my recollection. I look forward to visiting it again when we do our Hilton Head conference next year. And the place is called Swannanoa. And he's died, and back in '88, his wife, who was also a very sensitive spirit and a mystic, passed away. And it's called the University of Science and Philosophy at Waynesboro, Virginia. Now, as I say, he lived, as I remember, into his 80s. And where I was first introduced to him was a man by the name of Glenn. I can't remember the fellow's last name right now. Wrote a book called The Man Who Tapped the Secrets of the Universe. Glenn went out as a very sensitive Christian, but an adventuring Christian, and a more liberal one, looking for a man who would personify the coming age. Now, this is several decades ago. And he heard about all kinds of people, top-notch people spiritually all over the world. But ultimately, he heard about one whose name was repeated quite often. And they said, above all people, and there were many other candidates. You know, it's almost like looking for Stoneface in Nathaniel Hawthorne's old story. Ultimately, the one whose name came up time and again in the spirit was Walter Russell, who never went beyond 6th grade in formal education. And so he went and dug up Walter Russell, who had been, by that time, he was in his 50s, and remember this is decades ago, commissioned by President Roosevelt to do a great sculpture called the Four Freedoms. Now, the odd thing was that Walter Russell never sculpted anything until after he was 50 years of age. He was a financier, he was a genius, he was an inventor, he was all kinds of things. But above all, he was a man of the Spirit, who loved God from his earliest days, who was never imprisoned by the institutional church. And you don't see any of the grave clothes that you usually see because of that. And he learned to love and live and walk with God as a young man. And in fact, in my journal here, I took some of his words and put them down here. In my 95 journal, out of that book, The Man Who Tapped the Secrets of the Universe. And I'd like to have you listen to this, because if you want to develop what Brother Lawrence did, the practice of the presence of God, you have to practice it. I've stressed how, time and again, Williams is so magnificent in his translations. Practice. Even when you're cycling in black holes, practice. Practice cycling in black holes and practice cycling out of them. Accept it as a fact of life. You have to go through the darkness to get the light. You have to go through the death to get the life. And you have to go through the impotence and powerlessness to get the power. And here in Philippians chapter 4, in verse 8, and this is why Williams is so great on this. Now, brothers, practice. That's so much better in King James. Practice thinking on what is true, honest, just, pure, lovable, what is high tone. Practice. Yes, on everything that's excellent or praiseworthy. Practice the things you learned. It's very easy for me to lose my temper and blow my stack, and I advise people to do that if they've got a disposition like I have. When you're extremely pained, vent. But you know, after a while you can actually learn to practice, hey, I don't need to get quite so excited and quite uptight and neurotic and controlling as I've been all my life. I can relax and trust God in this situation. It's going to come out right. But you only find that out by experience. That's why Paul said, we glory in tribulations. Now, Paul did not glory in tribulations when he was in them a lot of times. And I'm not going into that today. But he could write that afterward, because he's saying exactly what I'm saying. You learn later on that I don't have to just absolutely get into a neurotic fit here and pay the negative price in my body, my mind, and everything else with the negative juices that flow through you when you do that kind of thing. Actually, I may be able to be calm this time and trust God to work this thing out. It's nice for me to see that at 67 years of age. It's taken me a long time to get there to see a few of those things showing up in my life. I like that. Practice. That's the benefit of practicing. You can get more peace in your life by practicing. Practice the things that you learned and received and heard from me and saw me do. And the God who gives us peace will be with you. Practice that. Now here's Walter Russell, who was selected by Glenn, and I can't recall the guy's name right now, and I think he might, maybe we could look it up on my bibliography. I think I put that book, The Secret of the Universe, on there in between sessions or something, but I've got a block on his name. But he wrote the book about Walter Russell called The Man Who Tapped the Secrets in the Universe. Listen carefully to this. Practice. That's why I took time to write it in my 95 journal. You may command nature. Nature is Sophia, a part of her, the feminine side of God. Think about that. You may command nature. For the last 3 years, I'm going to be bold enough to tell you that I obeyed God. God told me, He put me in the Bighorn Basin to bless the people. There had been a 10-year drought in the mountains, and you've heard me tell this story, and I'm not going to elaborate it very much. And God told me 3 years ago to start praying for heavy snow cover early in the spring on the mountains the following winter. After a 10-year drought, the grizzlies were coming clear down into the Bighorn Basin and clear into the edge, even of Cody. And we were having many grisly human encounters, and you don't want that. Because there's no food left in the high country for the elk or the deer or anybody else. And the bear, we have occasional black bears. Nancy and I saw a huge black bear in a canyon on the Chief Joseph Highway, but mostly we see grizzlies. But we don't want to see them up close and personal. We want them to be at a distance and up in the mountains. And even then, there are enough encounters. But God told me to start praying for that because we were in drought. We need the water. We were having dust storms in Cody at the time because the lake bed was so dry that our immense winds from the west would come in and pick that up, blow it through the notch, right through our screens and everything else. And it was a bad scene, especially if you have allergies. And God told me to start praying. You may command nature to the extent that you're willing to obey her, says Walter Russell. How true. I listened carefully to God. He said, you pray, I'm obeying Him. That we'll have a snowpack. Next year He told me to pray for more snowpack. We had a great snowpack. And then we had a greater one. And this year we have a record one, 220%. The normal snow cover, which concerns a lot of people, and it's in our paper. Beware of the runoff. But I believe that God will give us a runoff where there's no loss of life, limb, or property in the Bighorn Basin. And when God tells you to do something, faith comes by hearing that word that comes in your heart from God. And you'll, when you're first beginning to practice, you won't believe it. You'll do it with fear and trembling. You'll believe sometimes, you won't believe other times. Don't worry about that. It's like learning to play the piano or anything else. I listened to Tony playing in the lounge last night while I was having a delicious lamb dinner, and he's one of my favorite artists and has become a personal friend. And the man came up to him while he's playing magnificently. I love to hear him sing songs like I'm in a New York State of Mind. But he sits there and plays on either the piano or the organ, a very gifted musician and a wonderful brother in the Lord. And he's playing away, and this person comes up and talks to him while he's playing. Keeps right on playing. And he's carrying on a conversation with this guy while he's playing. I'll tell you one thing, he didn't do that in the first year he started to play the piano. And not in the second either. Practice. Practice. Tend to your knitting. I remember when I was a little boy. You know, you don't remember too much from your first 10 years, and most certainly not from your first 5 years. I remember sitting in our living room, and we had a big console radio. No TVs back in those days. It was prehistoric times. And it was a big Farnsworth radio. No, Zenith. That's right. It was a great family decision when we had to decide between a beautiful Farnsworth and a beautiful Zenith, and we kept both of them for a week or 10 days and decided on the Zenith. But, you know, no TV, but everybody could sit around and listen to I Love a Mystery or the Green Hornet or any number of those things at night, The Shadow, all of those old radio programs. The Lone Ranger, Jack Armstrong when I got home at 5:30 in the afternoon. And this is a very pleasant memory of sitting around with a family in a family semicircle around the big Zenith radio, which incidentally had wonderful fidelity for those days, sound-wise. And we kids would be playing on the floor. Sometimes we'd play games. Sometimes we were playing with our trucks and cars. Dad would be sitting in his easy chair, and Mom would be sitting there, Grandma over here. But Mom was never idle, and her fingers were either flying with crocheting, and I still, thank God, have many of her throw blankets, or 2 or 3 of them anyway, that she knitted for every son, daughter, grandson, granddaughter, great-grandson, great-granddaughter. And that's what she did in her latter years. She lived to be 92 years of age. But while she's sitting there listening to the radio, her fingers are flying like mad. At first, the statement comes, tend to your knitting. I remember when she began to learn how to crochet somehow. I still remember that. That was one painstaking little knot or whatever you call the things at the time. Her fingers weren't flying, and she was paying attention to what she was doing. But when she sat there night after night knitting in the family circle, she wasn't paying any attention to what she was doing. Her fingers were flying like the spindle on a loom, and she was making a beautiful pattern. The pattern was in her mind and heart, but she was weaving it in that nice piece of knitting that she was doing. And I still have the evidence of that. A couple nice, what do they call them? Afghans that she knitted for me. And so, at the beginning, when you're learning to play the piano, or you're learning to knit, you need to tend to your knitting. And do what Paul advises here, and practice cycling in and out. And keep practicing. And just think, if you have hunger, and we in this room have hunger, and the people who listen to this tape have hunger, they wouldn't be spending time otherwise. You have in your heart hunger. What is that? Blessed, extremely happy is the translation from Greek, are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, after the right thing. Don't think of righteousness as I'm hungering and thirsting after the list that evangelicals or fundamentalists will hand me, so whatever is fun is sin. I'm not talking about that kind of righteousness. Righteousness is what's right for you, right out of God's plan that's written in your heart. That's righteousness. Christ is made unto us wisdom, Sophia, feminine, righteousness. 1 Corinthians 1:30 I'm quoting. Christ is made. What's right for you? Christ will tell you what's right for you in your heart. You have to learn a little bit at a time, like you learn to knit. Tend to your knitting. Listen to what Walter Russell says. You may command nature to the extent only in which you're willing to obey her. Listen to wisdom, Jesus, Sophia, speaking in your heart. The cosmic Christ. You cannot intelligently, Walter Russell goes on to say, obey that which you do not comprehend. Obviously not. Therefore, I also say, ask of nature that you may be one with her. Now, nature is a part of Sophia, sometimes the negative part. When you get floods like you have in the Midwest, for example. Ask of nature that you may be one with her, and she will whisper her secrets to you. I want to tell you, Walter Russell's right on the money. For years, nature's been whispering her secrets to me. I didn't get to be able to pray about the mountains and see God answer on a large scale without listening to little secrets about little things. Before, I wouldn't have had the confidence at all to say, you can, yes, not me doing it, you asked me to be co-redeemer. I'll pray that as a priest here in Bighorn Basin to cover these mountains with a record snowfall this year. I got my request. What's in your heart? A desire. God puts it there. That's the right thing for you to ask for. Check it out with God. You'll know whether it's the right desire or not. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He'll give you the desires of your heart. Psalm 37:5, I think it is. Delight yourself. That's what he's saying. You can command nature only to the extent you're willing to obey her, and you cannot intelligently obey what you don't comprehend. Spend time with her. Therefore, I say, ask of nature that you may be one with her, and she'll whisper her secrets to you, to the extent that you are prepared to listen. Now, if you want to be grabbed by the scruff of the neck by what's known as the world system, And I remember some other things my mother used to do down in our dingy old basement. We had a beautiful home, but we had a very dingy basement. And we didn't have washing machines back in prehistoric times like they do today. They had the old kind where you turned the wringer at first, and then the wringer turned itself later on. But you had to put everything through the wringer. And Mom used to be down there putting everything through the wringer. Well, you know, you may find yourself in a place like that where you're going through the wringer. And the world system will try and put you through the wringer. And it'll say, you are nothing but a robot. Now, it doesn't use that terminology because it's not in its propaganda department to do that. But the fact is, the world system grabs us by the scruff of the neck and says, now you're a working bee here, and you just go right through the same old ritual with one foot nailed to the floor. And you find yourself doing the same old things, and as Daniel prophesied, in the last days, the devil will try to wear out the saints of the Most High. And you get so tired you can't do anything, just because you have to work so hard. Cycle through that black hole, but keep saying to God, I want to find some liberation in this thing, and there's a way that I can find some liberation, and you might have to wait a long time, but you find some liberation in it, and you will find some liberation in it. When I look back over my old journals, and it's just been that the Spirit led me to do that, and I've journaled for years, and I see the price I paid in Florida for the ministry I had there, and I got thrown out over the wall, and they set me on fire before they threw me over the wall, it makes my hair stand on end. When I read my journals, it made me angry. And when I was in that, I had just emerged from the Bible Institute of New England and its collapse and having to struggle with fundamentalists there. I say today I'm the most happy and contented I've ever been. It took me a long time to get out in the desert as God's golden eagle. But I got there. We're in school here. We name our mountaintop experiences and our seminars schools of life for a reason, because this is the school of life. And those are Mount of Transfiguration experiences in it. But you don't spend a lot of time on the Mount of Transfiguration. Spend a whole lot of it in the valley. That's what the disciples had to learn. No wonder they wanted. And when you go to a school of life, I've never seen it fail. Everybody wants to stay there. They don't want to see the week come to an end. Because you're experiencing group ecstasy, which someday will be the experience of redeemed humanity. But only comes now and then in flashes and bits and pieces now. Maybe I'll read you something else from Walter Russell on that later, because he defined it so beautifully. She'll only whisper her secrets to you to the extent that you're prepared to be alone with her, with nature, and to be thus inspired by her mighty whisperings within your consciousness. Listen carefully, please. Nature is a most jealous God. She will not whisper her inspiring revelations to you unless you're absolutely alone with her. I would suggest this, because we've all had our times, like I used to in my extremely neurotic days serving God. Thank you, Carl. Spend 90 to 110 hours a week in administrative work trying to preserve the Bible Institute of New England, a very sinking, leaky tub, from going down. And drove myself absolutely bananas until I was so exhausted I couldn't do anything. You know, you have to back off from that and find a way to back off from it, and God found, and He wanted to teach me a deep lesson, and we learn obedience by the things that we suffer. Never let that get out of your hat band. If Jesus learned it that way, we don't learn it because we just sit in a class like this. We learn it through the rough and tumble of existence, and every one of us. Don't look at some other guy. How do you know what a person is without being in his moccasins, as the Indians said? Or what his trials are, or her trials are? We don't know. All we can do is love and help one another. And it looks like a person can never get released from that circumstance. I thought I'd never get released from that circumstance. I did get released from that circumstance and thrown into another cauldron in Florida, because that was my calling in those days. Were there no happy moments? There were ecstatic moments. There were triumphs. There were great victories. Time to change the tape. Now I want to repeat what the last phrase here from Walter Russell. Nature is a most jealous God, and she will not whisper her inspiring revelations to you unless you are absolutely alone with her. Now, I think of people who have to work 8 hours, 10 hours a day in difficult circumstances, and you drive back and forth to work and the rest of it. And there are heavy schedules involved. And a lot of the time you have to keep your mind on what you're doing. But if you ask God, and I love my dear friend Walter Leckler, and once again when I reviewed those journals and thought back over the time and the sacred temples that we've been in, for example, Nassau Lounge in Princeton, New Jersey. Sitting there with Jess Lehrer one night, and Walter Leckler, and Dan Kazriel, I know he wasn't there that time, Bruce Larson, some other people like that, R.D. Lang. And to think what happened during that great Mount of Transfiguration experience. Well, we don't get to live there all the time. Then we parcel out in those times, and you won't, if you come to Hilton Head and God anoints that like He has everything else, and I hope you will, then you have to come down off the mount as Peter, James, and John did. They went up to the mount and they saw Moses and Elijah transfigured, and for the first time they saw the cosmic Christ. They saw Jesus transfigured in gleaming garments, brilliant garments, and they heard God speak very directly and say, "This is my beloved Son, hear Him." Pay no more attention to Moses, or to Elijah, or to the Old Testament. Listen to what the cosmic Christ tells you. David E. Baugh develops that magnificently in his new book, El Elyon Now. That's a beautiful, and by the way, pointed out something that is really wonderful. Yahweh was never called the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. El Elyon is the Father. He says, Son of the Most High God, El Elyon. That's something else. Well, in any case, you have these great mountaintop experiences. Come to those mountaintops. You live in the energy of them. Well, frankly, if it's a great mountaintop, the rest of your life. Believe me, Peter, James, and John never forgot what happened to them, but Peter said, let's make 3 tents. Let's settle down here. You can't do that. In our evolution, we are not at the place where we can settle down there. In our spiritual evolution, we have to live off the energy and genius of what's given us in the high moments as we go on through the humdrum of daily life, when the world system takes you and shoves you through a wringer like my mother used to do with the towels and the wash and the laundry. However, you can listen to my friend Walter Leckler and say, don't go out looking for gold nuggets that weigh 5 pounds and 10 pounds apiece. Look for gold flakes. Gold flakes every day. Look for a little peaceful moment where instead of grousing about something and griping, you can practice thanksgiving. Now, when Paul got extremely pained, he practiced grousing, the same as I do and the same as you do. But he learned better and better because he practiced to give thanks. It says, be not much drunk with wine, wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit. How can you help yourself? Learn how to talk to yourself. For Christ's sake, learn how to talk to yourself. Because you're not talking to yourself. You're talking to the God who's in your heart. Speaking to yourself in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, like coming down this morning singing, "It's in every one of us to be wise," or "Every day above ground's a good day," or "Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble." Listening to good music. Speak to yourself in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Sing. And make melody in your heart to the Lord. You can do that very quietly. I was doing it I do it all the time now. Except when I'm in a blue funk. But I practice it when I'm not. And even when I'm in a blue funk, I said, hey, I'm going through this cycle. Now, God, here's what I think of you for putting me in it. Get me out of it. And bring out the maximum benefit out of it. But don't be too hard on yourself. What I'm trying to say here is learn the pattern. God says in your evolution you'll have mountaintops. Look at the chart. It'll zigzag way up once in a while, like the stock market, and you'll be up there. You won't be up there for, a long time. You'd be down here a lot of the time. You know what happened to the disciples as soon as they got off the Mount of Transfiguration? They went back down into the valley. So do we. And immediately meant unbelief and impotence and powerlessness. And here was a demon-possessed person that the disciples who'd been left behind couldn't cope with, and neither could the ones who came off the mountain. And it challenged Jesus and made him disgusted. He said, "How long will I be with you, faithless generation?" Because he was astounded at our lack of faith. But remember, Jesus was God. And he identified with our humanity. But there were times when he lost his equilibrium and got disgusted. And don't forget that happens quite frequently in the gospel. And you'll find it in your walk with God even today. There were times when he expected too much out of people. And that was one of the times. So he cast out the demon. But when you're down there in the valley of unbelief, and you've just come off a mountaintop, and that can be a real crash, by the way, psychologically. You've got gold that you got on the mountaintop, and you can get gold flakes every day by speaking to yourself in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, communing with nature while you're driving home from work, or at your machine, or at your desk, or when you're using your hammer, or whatever. You can talk to God. I talk to God when I'm doing letters. I love to, talk to God when I'm doing letters, because if I usually do about 80 letters a month, and I do penned letters by and large. I like that because it's very personal. That's why I like it. I don't type. I don't want to type. I don't do it on computer. I have a general newsletter made up, as you know, and then I put my personal notes on it. Because I feel like I'm really communicating with each one of you in heart when I do that. And personalizing. And that's what I want to do. I want to speak to each person deeply in their heart. That's why I use the pen and I pray while I'm doing it. I'm practicing the presence of God when I'm writing those things. I used to say, by God, I'm going to do 30 letters today, because look at how this is piled up on me, and I, being neurotic, I have a tape, "Hi, I'm Bruce and I'm neurotic." I got to get this thing done to the bottom. No, you don't got to get that thing done to the bottom. And I finally, after years, learned that I didn't have to get it done to the bottom. No, what worked much better? Here's a gold flake. God said, don't try to do any more than 10, and then you can give each letter real attention, golden attention. And they'll eventually get done, and nobody's going to beat up on you if you don't get it done by tomorrow, if it's done 2 weeks from now. I learned to slow down and rest more. I labored to enter into rest. Well, it pays dividends. Last night I was sitting in the dining room, and the night before, communing with God. And we have great desire. God puts desire in your heart. Whatsoever things you desire, when you pray, believe that you receive them and you'll have them. I'm sitting in a wonderful dining room and eating a wonderful lamb dinner, and I love good hotels and I love good dining rooms, and I love nice people around me and great music, and I had it from Tony. And I watched him, and he'd practiced. So he didn't have to pay attention anymore. And if you practice the presence of God, as Brother Lawrence advised in his great old book, which is what I've been teaching this morning, and you have your mountaintops and you have your deep valleys, but if you keep right on practicing, as Walter Leckler would say, look for gold flakes and learn to redeem the time. Paul has a great phrase, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Now, I can sit and be drinking pickle juice and looking like the devil himself when I'm really displeased and giving off negative vibrations that even the cat runs away from me. Or I can learn a little better to practice the presence of God in that moment and say, I don't like where I am right now, but Lord, where are you in this thing? And begin to speak to God in my heart. He's in me, in my deep being. It's in every one of us to be wise. Find your heart. Open up both of your eyes. We can all know everything. Wisdom is in us. And I'm sitting there thinking of what, through these many years, since way back in the 1950s, the early 1950s, at Highland Lake Bible Conference, and I'd been born again after my first year in seminary. I thought I was born again a long time before that, but I got saved in seminary. And my heart was on fire for God. From that time, I loved God. I wanted to know God. I know you're people who want to know God and have come to know God better and better. And as a result, you've got sons and daughters who want to know God. I tell you, it's a joy to get communications, letters from my sons and from my son Vaughn in California and his dreams. He gets on that computer and will send me a booklet of what God's been doing in his life. Here's a physician who works in an emergency room in Bakersfield. And he spends his time communicating with God when he does. He's picked up some of the old man's osmosis, by osmosis, some of my desire. There's desire in your heart to know God. And I'm sitting there and I have 2 great evenings in that dining room, getting rested up from jet lag. I went to bed last night, about 5 o'clock I guess it was this morning. I had a great experience. I had a wonderful dream. Now God, speaks to us in dreams. It's so wonderful. And I put on the last tape how God communicated to me in dreams that the feminine appreciated that I had liberated them from the bondage of conservative religion. You'll remember that at the end, perhaps, of the last tape. And how the great old man of the heart, a very radiantly handsome old man, was sitting there in that same Bible Institute dream, which I won't repeat now. But he couldn't thank me enough that I had liberated the feminine and changed the scene by being, not by doing. See, in your earlier life, you want to do it. You want to do it by gunfighting, if you're called to a prophetic ministry or whatever. That's what got me into hot water in Florida and got me into hot water, and I was doing the right thing in those days. I'm not saying for young prophets, don't gunfight. Do it to the best of your ability, and then run like hell. And throw a dirty letter over the wall. That's what I've always advised young prophets to do while you're running out into the desert. But there's a better way to do it. And believe me, we're doing it. And there's no question about it scientifically. And I was sitting there reading Walter Russell's book, which God only recently told me to get, The Secret of Light, which is based on great revelations that he had when God took him up into a high mountain many decades ago and showed him everything at once, in one great flash. How does that happen? That happens, I want to make sure I got enough tape to do this. I think I have, yes. I've never heard anyone describe how it happens better, and this will go along with the Mount of Transfiguration thing. His earlier chapter 4 in The Secret of Light describes what I've been attempting to describe, and I'm going to read his description, a little bit of it anyway. Listen very carefully, please. Beyond the genius. Now, geniuses like Thomas Edison, who blessed us with, I forget how many countless inventions, thousands. He used to sit on the end of his pier with a fishing pole in his hand and a line dangling in the bay down there at Fort Myers, Florida. And he went back in one day after doing this countless times, walked off his pier and went back into his house, and his wife says, "How come you never catch any fish?" He says, "Because I never put any bait on the hook." She says, "What are you sitting out there in the end of the dock for then?" He says, "I'm thinking." Now, you see, he communed with nature. He said, "I don't want fish to bother me." This was just his ploy. So he sat there with no bait on the hook on the end. You've got to be a little kooky to walk with God, and be an inventor or a genius or whatever. And most certainly a mystic. They're strange ducks. Not that their God isn't a strange duck. Now, I want to tell you that right now. Expect some strange things out of God. How would you like to be a prophet in the Old Testament? And it literally says, I think it's in Ezekiel, that he picked him up by the hair of his head and transported him to a distant spot. I don't want to be transported by my hair to any spot. I haven't got that much to begin with, but I don't want the rest of it to be pulled out. God can be pretty kooky. Anybody who gets out of church where they've got God all figured out and they've got him in a tapestry up there in front behind the cross. That's God right there, and that's the pattern, and he never departs from it. That's a person who doesn't know God. That is absolutely a person who does not know God. That's a person who knows a dead idol. If you, as many of you in this room have, walk with God, you know very well he has his idiosyncrasies. And I threatened to do a tape, and I finally did one. Hi, I'm the universe, and I'm neurotic. And remember, the universe is God, as Buckminster Fuller said. So you'll find some kooky traits in God. So there's anybody who really listens to other dimensions, like a genius, will sit out there with doing some nutty thing like fishing with no bait on his hook. But what's he come back with? God bless the light bulb and a whole lot of other things, eh? Well, here's what Walter Russell, another genius and a mystic, most certainly says: beyond the genius is the mystic. Beyond the genius is the mystic. The mystic is the one who has attained cosmic consciousness by a complete severance of the seats of consciousness and sensation. He is then almost totally unaware of his body and is totally aware of the light of God centering him. Omniscience comes to him in that timeless, blinding flash of light which is characteristic of a complete severance. Back in 1600, a shoe cobbler with a family to support sat looking into a pewter mug. I don't know why he was staring at that. Could have been staring at that statue there. And all of a sudden, in a blinding flash of inspiration, he saw everything. God showed him his heart, just like that. That man's name was Jacob Boehme, or Jacob Boehme, as Americans would say it. The man who's written, as far as I'm concerned, I haven't read all the commentaries by any means on Boehme, but is the French physicist Basarab Nicolescu. He said Boehme did not write about that experience for 12 years afterward while he was grubbing out a living as a shoe cobbler for his family. But when he did write, he wrote such brilliant stuff that this French physicist picks it up in the late 20th century and says, this man saw quantum mechanics 400 years before scientists saw it. In one brilliant flash. That's why we call them saints. Meister Eckhart, Teresa of Avila, and the rest of them. Saint Teresa. And I would remind you how kooky God can be, who said, it's no wonder you have so few friends when you treat the ones you have so poorly. That's somebody that knows God. That's not somebody looking at a tapestry in a church. Now, he's almost unaware of his body and totally aware of the light of God centering in him. Omniscience, all-knowing, comes to him in that timeless, blinding flash of light, which is characteristic of complete severance. You never know when this will come. Sometimes it comes in slow waves. He's going to tell us a little bit about this. But I remember when I was a young minister, fresh out of seminary, and a rising fast star in my denomination, the book that most aroused my curiosity in the New Testament, which I felt nobody had a handle on in seminary among my excellent professors, was the Epistle of the Hebrews. So I went to Limerick, Pennsylvania. I'm going to visit there again on this trip just to look at that church. And that was a big church, had 1,000 people out at that time on Sunday morning. I guess it's even larger now. But Clarence Didden was our denominational president, and a very dear friend of mine. He was an older man and a spiritual father to me, one of my many spiritual fathers. And Trudy and I stayed in a missionary house for 3 days and nights there. And I thought, oh boy, I have set this time aside to study Hebrews because I have upcoming conferences, and I really would like to teach Hebrews, and I don't understand it at all, even though I'd memorized large portions of it. Well, I went in there and I studied my head off on Hebrews the first day. And I went to bed exhausted that night. There's nothing to tire you out faster than metal work all day. Totally dissatisfied. I thought Hebrews is an enigmatic closed book. I did that, so help me God, the second day, and got nothing. I did that halfway through the third day, and I was really exhausted by that time and exasperated. And I said, I'm going to take a nap. And I lay down in the middle of the afternoon the third day, took a deep nap, and when I awoke, I had to grab my notebook, which I think I still have in storage in the garage back there, and my pen, and start writing, because in one blinding flash, the whole book of Hebrews opened to me like a flower, instantly. And I taught, and it took me probably 2 or 3 hours to write the seed thoughts. And through the years that followed, I taught Hebrews many times out of what I saw in one blinding mystical flash. That doesn't happen very often. Sometimes it happens on a much smaller scale, but that's what he's talking about here. And he says this is the experience that illuminated St. Paul. Every timeless flash of intense inspiration which comes to any man is a partial illumination, for inspiration is the manner in which new knowledge comes to man from the cosmos. If you have a great desire in your heart for God like I did then as a young man, and do now, and many of you do, you take the time that you can devote to God. Learn to practice even when you're working, turning your heart to God 1,000 times a day, as Brother Lawrence used to say. And you'll be surprised someday God will zap you with a blessed lightning stroke, and you'll see things you've never seen before, and you'll know it's the truth from one end to the other, and you'll see it. Then you'll see it comprehensively, like my mother when she finished her Afghan, and you could see the whole pattern. Before that, it's like knitting or embroidery, and you're looking at the underside, and you see nothing but chaos. All of a sudden, God flips it over, and you see the whole picture. That's brilliant inspiration. But listen, that doesn't come very often in life. That's the Mount of Transfiguration thing. In all of history, less than 40 cases of partial cosmic consciousness are known, Walter Russell tells us. I don't know whether that's exactly accurate or not, but he's talking about the real big inspirations like Jakob Burma had. But, listen carefully. The way to gradually attain cosmic consciousness, the way to gradually attain it, I want to underline this. See, this isn't gold and yellow, which means great truth. This is gold and truth in my book here. I'll hold it up there, like this. The way to gradually attain cosmic consciousness is to intensify. This is what I've been teaching all morning. Intensify one's conscious awareness by much aloneness and companionship with God while manifesting Him in every moment and in every task of life. Think with me again. Then I'm going back to the dining room and quit. The way to gradually attain cosmic consciousness is to intensify one's conscious awareness by much aloneness and companionship with God while manifesting Him in every moment and in every task of life. Moment by moment companionship with God. Why do I have to have an undisciplined mind and spirit when I'm driving down here this morning and end up cussing drivers that cut me off? I don't have to. I have had that experience many times because I have an ornery disposition. But coming down 295 this morning, I met nice people. You know why? Because I was singing. I rarely ever meet, and they are no great problem to me if I do meet them, when I'm grooving on God. Moment by moment companionship. That's what I was having today with God brings with it so great a realization of oneness with Him. A great desire to know God. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst, they'll be filled. Blessed are the pure in heart, they'll see God. Maybe in a blinding flash like Burma or like Walter Russell here. This is the way he got his stuff. God took him up into an exceedingly high moment and he knew everything at once. And believe me, this is before quantum physics was popularized and the man saw everything. The transformation into that full realization of unity is apt to take place at any time if you use moment-by-moment companionship with God. Now, please hear this. Let it sink in. The deterrent to developing this kind of consciousness, the deterrent, what's the negative here, is the feeling that God is far away instead of being within, in your heart. And that we can reach that faraway God through sources outside of ourselves, like the church, the pastor, and the Bible. God is within you. The genius of the New Testament, at that stage of our evolution 2,000 years ago, was that God really zapped a whole bunch of people, 120 in an upper room, and subsequently a lot more, with real lightning, a rushing mighty wind, and cloven tongues of fire. That's like lightning. And when you get 120, if he says there are only 40 cases in all of history outside of that, I don't know whether he's right or not on that. I have to take his word for it because I've never researched it. But in any case, there aren't very many. But if you get 120 people and God wants to really give a great leap forward to man's spiritual consciousness and says enough of dead religion And even after that, we still have it with us in eminent degree institutionalized in the synagogues and the churches. But it's changing today. You zap 120 people, and all of a sudden they realize God's closer than my skin. I am one. I am part of God. I am God. He's within me. Ye are God's. This is Christ in you, the hope of glorification. Many of them probably couldn't even read. Because, in the Roman Empire, the citizenship was about 10%, as I recall. And they were the elite. Not everybody could read. But these guys could hear from God. And furthermore, with the Word, when you can hear from God like that, comes knowing. You know it. This is why Watchman Nee was so right. When he said, if you have a sin you can't conquer, don't worry about it. It's like Harold Hill said, I tell young Christians when they're having trouble with their sins to enjoy them as long as they can. And when you get tired of them, say, Lord, you've got a problem. That's terrific preaching of grace. That's exactly it. Watchman Nee said, don't worry about it. You can struggle with it all you want to, and even if you get a victory, it'll be a carnal defeat for you. And it is. God, I abstain from that cigarette if you're trying to get rid of that habit, for example, or whatever, and then you abstain from it, but you feel like the very devil himself because it's not the right kind of victory. It's by struggling and striving and straining. He said, listen, when God gives you a word, with the word comes the faith, and you'll be delivered like that, you'll know it. Well, when you get one of these blinding flashes, or you get it a little bit incrementally, like most of us do, because we can't stay in the mountaintop all the while, you get it little by little, as Dad used to say, steady by jerks. The faith comes with it, and you know this is right. You know this is right for you. You know what that's called? Righteousness. When God tells Carl here something in his heart that he's been pondering which way to go here, and he's been struggling like mad, and there are several chutes off the road, he doesn't know whether to take left, 1, 2, 3, or 4, or right, or center. And God says, this is the way, walk ye in it, which he's promised to tell us eventually. Thine ears shall hear a word behind thee. How's that? From the heart. Saying, this is the way. Walk ye in it. Why, when God began to tell me, I want you to spend a lot of time with me in the desert, I've learned to love the high desert. And I don't mean only a literal desert. I mean alone with God. But I mean the literal desert, surrounded by the northern Rockies. You can't imagine how peaceful it is in the desert. And only the birds are singing, and there are birds and plenty of them in the desert. Isn't that wonderful? And you can hear God and see and feel and smell God. I recommend it to you. Then when God tells you something, thine ears shall hear a word behind thee saying, this is the way, walk ye in it. And you think it's too good to be true. Like during these last several years, and I've said to God, I don't have to fight with these pastors and churches anymore. I don't want you fighting with them anymore. You served your time. Now this is where you should be right now. And you'll do more by morphic resonance. By instinct, as Walter called it back there, because there was no word morphogenetic field when he got his blinding flash. But his chapter here is labeled instinct. The deterrent to this kind of consciousness is to think God's far away, or you can find him in a book, or a church, or through a priest, or a rabbi, or a pastor. He's in you. He hid the secret in the best place. You're the temple of the living God. I just think of how my dad knew God, how his hands flew winding coils for 42 years for armatures for big locomotives in the General Electric Company in Erie. He didn't even have to think of what he did. He turned into a saint. I came home from seminary from personal evangelism class and tried to correct my dad, like college classes usually do. I said, now, Dad, you should witness every day. All he did was smile at me. He didn't even reprove me. When I went to his funeral, there was a real heller, and I mean that's the only label to paste on the man, who really knew what it was to live a real fast life, and his name was Delbert. He was my brother-in-law's cousin. And he always had a big cut of tobacco chucked in the side of his cheek. And he pulled me aside at Dad's funeral and he said, "I'm not a Christian. But he said, if I ever become one, I want to be one like your dad." I heard that from person after person through my life. He didn't need to personal evangelize. He had done a very good job. I think I'd just like to say this in closing, because I'm running out of tape. When I get into this stuff, I love it. You're running out of tape too? Time to quit then. Well, I'll quit real quick. Let me just add this then. Just sitting in the dining room there, glowing in this stuff the last 2 nights, seeing my desires fulfilled with God, having God commune with me. About 5 o'clock this morning, God loved me up. And here's how he did it. You know how God speaks in dreams. And in this dream, I was lying on the ground on my back. And I had a lovely lady on top of me by the name of Diane Grins, and she was kissing me up, and she could really kiss. No skinny lips. And all of you, or many of you anyway, know John Tobin, who's one of my spiritual sons and a favorite guy. He was standing, we call him JT. He was in the dream, and he was standing there looking at me, really enjoying myself with this lovely lady kissing me up, loving me up, with a big grin on his face. I woke up, needless to say, extremely happy. And God said, "Who's Diane Grins to you?" I said, "Why, I haven't seen her in 45 years, I guess." Maybe not quite that long. I didn't figure it out numerically, but in any case, back in high school days. And I had to be about 14 years old. I think I was in my earliest high school years. Now, she was an upperclassman, and you folk may remember that in high school there's a real social barrier between freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. I mean, seniors were the big guys, the adults, etc. And you didn't penetrate that barrier very often and go up the scale. Well, I was a freshman, I think, at the time, and I was a debater, and we had an excellent debate team, so we went to the county debate championship. And Diane Grins, an upperclassman, a very sophisticated, dark-haired young lady that I thought was like a goddess, went along on that team as an upperclassman. I, as an upstart freshman, was on the team. But she and I were very friendly on that trip, which is amazing. I crossed a couple of class barriers. But I didn't dare really tell her how much I thought of her. She was an early girlfriend, because she was an upperclassman and there was an aura about her. She represented to me the mystical, untouchable woman at that stage of development. Well, what was God saying? It was God loving me up as Sophia. The mystical, untouchable woman was lying on top of me, kissing me up for sitting and listening to her and communing with her for the last 2 nights in the dining room and having a high day in the Lord both times. And my sons and daughters are as pleased as can be as a result of that. You can't get much more than that, to be kissed by God and loved up by God. And that's why I suggest practice. Practice. You'll be rewarded.